8 mice were placed inside a perfect world. Unlimited food, unlimited water, no predators, no diseases, no competition from outside. Soft nesting material in every corner. The temperature held perfectly stable. Space enough, by the designer's calculation, for 3,800 animals to live comfortably. The mice that went in were the healthiest specimens from a federal research colony. They wanted for nothing. 5 years later, every single one of them was dead. Not from starvation, not from infection, not from anything a veterinarian could have diagnosed or treated. The food was still there at the end. The water was still there. The enclosure was still clean. The cause of death in every case was something the autopsy could not find, because it had happened years before the body stopped working. The experiment was called Universe 25. The man who designed it was John Calhoun, an American ethologist at the National Institute of Mental Health, and he had spent 2 decades asking one question: what happens to a society when nothing is hard anymore? He had built 24 earlier versions of this experiment, in barns, in forest enclosures, in laboratory rooms, always with the same conditions. No scarcity, no escape, no predators. And in every single one, he had watched the same pattern emerge. The population would surge, then the behavior would distort, then the colony would collapse. 24 times. Universe 25 was designed to be the clean final answer. The perfect enclosure, the healthiest founders, the most rigorous documentation. When the paper reached the public, the conclusion most people took from it was simple. Comfort kills. Abundance kills. A life without struggle destroys itself. The image of the mice dying in paradise became one of the most cited cautionary tales of the 20th century. But that was not what Calhoun actually concluded. His real finding was sitting in the paper in his own words, and it was harder to dismiss. For the first 100 days inside Universe 25, almost nothing happened. The 8 founders explored the enclosure, learned the geography, and established territories. Then the first litters were born, and the population began to double every 55 days. By day 315, more than 600 animals were living inside, and this is where the structure began to come apart. In a normal mouse colony, when population growth exhausts the available territory, the surplus animals leave. They find new ground. Inside Universe 25, there was no new ground. The young males, the ones who would ordinarily disperse, claim territory, court females, establish themselves in the social order, had nowhere to go. Every role was already filled. They drifted into the center of the enclosure and formed listless pools of bodies. Calhoun watched them for hours. They were well-fed, physically healthy, and completely inert. When attacked, they did not fight back. They absorbed the damage, moved a few feet, and lay down again. At the same time, a second group emerged going the opposite direction. Frantic, indiscriminate, moving through the colony without following any of the social rituals that normally govern mouse behavior. Mothers began abandoning their young. In some sections of the colony, fewer than 1 in 20 newborn mice survived to weaning. And then there were the ones Calhoun named the beautiful ones. They were the mice born into the collapse, raised by mothers too exhausted and overwhelmed to invest in them, with no functioning social world to inherit. They grew up healthy and perfectly groomed because they never fought. They never mated. They moved through the colony as though no other mouse existed in it. They had, in Calhoun's phrase, opted out of the species. The last birth inside Universe 25 happened on day 920. After that, no new mice were born. Calhoun wrote that the mice had died 2 deaths. The first was the death of the spirit. The second was the death of the body. The first happened years before the second. And then he wrote the part that most accounts leave out. The killer, he said, was not comfort. It was the disappearance of meaningful roles. The food never ran out. The water never ran out. What ran out was something nobody had thought to put in the paradise to begin with, a reason for each individual to participate in the life of the whole. The same year Calhoun began designing his experiments, a psychologist at the University of Wisconsin named Harry Harlow was running a different kind of test, one that illuminated why the disappearance of roles was so catastrophic. Harlow had separated infant rhesus monkeys from their mothers at birth. Each infant was placed in a cage with 2 surrogate mothers. One was made of bare wire mesh and equipped with a feeding bottle. One was covered in soft terry cloth and had no food at all. The question was simple. Which one would the infant choose? The infants went to the wire mother to feed, and then immediately returned to the cloth mother. They spent the overwhelming majority of their time clinging to the cloth surrogate, the one that gave them nothing to eat. When something frightened them, they did not run to the wire mother that had fed them. They ran to the cloth mother and held on. Harlow's conclusion was that what the infants needed most was not nutrition. It was contact, the experience of being held, of being connected to something that responded to their presence. The infants raised with the wire mother and no cloth surrogate grew up profoundly damaged. They could not socialize normally. Many could not reproduce. They sat rocking in the corners of their cages. They had been fed. They had been warm. They had lacked nothing the body required to survive. What they had lacked was contact with something that made their presence matter. And the absence of that left marks the body carried for the rest of its life. Think about what these 2 experiments are saying together. The mice in Universe 25 did not die from hunger. They died when the supply of meaningful roles, things to do that mattered to the structure around them, was exhausted. The monkeys in Harlow's cages did not fail to thrive from malnutrition. They failed when the experience of matching to something else was removed from their world. The need being described in both cases is the same. Not food, not warmth, not safety in the physical sense. Something harder to name and much harder to provide. The experience of being necessary. Of having a place in a structure that would notice your absence. Think of the beautiful ones, perfectly groomed, physically flawless, moving through the colony as if nothing else in it existed. They were not sick in any way a diagnosis could capture. They had simply stopped participating, because the social world they were born into had no place left for them to fill. You have probably known someone who looked, from the outside, completely fine. The apartment was kept. The meals were made. The surface was intact. And something was gone that no examination would have found. A connection between being here and it meaning something to something outside themselves. In 2015, economists Case and Angus Deaton at Princeton University published a paper in PNAS that documented something that should not have been possible. Mortality rates among middle-aged white Americans, a population with access to food, shelter, and healthcare, had reversed. Not declined, reversed. Where every other comparable demographic in the developed world was living longer, this group was dying younger, and had been since 1999. The cause was not disease. It was not poverty in the material sense. Case and Deaton called what they were observing deaths of despair, death by suicide, by drug overdose, by alcoholic liver disease. Not starvation, not infection. Self-destruction in a population that was not, by any conventional measure, deprived. If mortality rates for this group had simply held at their 1998 levels, 96,000 deaths would not have occurred between 1999 and 2013. 96,000 people. The pattern Case and Deaton traced was not random. It was concentrated in communities where stable economic and social roles, the kind that told a person where they stood, what they were for, how they fit into the structure around them, had disappeared. Not the food, not the shelter, the role. The collapse of Universe 25 happened without anyone removing a single resource from the enclosure. The deaths Case and Deaton documented happened in a country where the pantries were full. What ran out, in both cases, was the same thing Calhoun had identified 50 years earlier. Not abundance, not safety, somewhere to fit. Calhoun spent the rest of his life not predicting the collapse. He spent it trying to prevent it. He kept building new universes, changing the variables, looking for the one thing he could put back into a paradise that would let it keep working. He believed it could be done. He wrote that as physical space contracts, the only path forward is to extend into conceptual space, into ideas, into work that creates roles that did not exist before. He called it ideational generativity, a long phrase for a simple idea. The way out is to keep making new reasons to be here. The mice had no choice about what world they were born into. The beautiful ones had no way to create roles that the enclosure had not already filled. But the enclosure they lived in was 9 feet wide. Yours is not. The question is what you build inside it.